So this episode of Having Fun with Photoshop is talking about the clone stamp tool. And the clone stamp tool is one of the more robust retouching features in Photoshop. And unlike the healing brush, which helps things heal and blend together, and the patch tool and the content aware fill, the clone stamp tool is all you. There's no help whatsoever from Photoshop. Literally what the clone stamp tool does is just copies and pastes into basically cloning one area to another. So the four areas that I want to talk about here are going to be the frisbee on the roof right there, the vents in the roof line, and the little stilts that are holding up to the tree, and then the shadow going across the driveway. Now, I wouldn't go in and use my spot healing brush and stuff like that on here, because these things, I really do need to replace it with something else. I may be able to use the spot healing brush on, these little lines going across there, but anything that requires a lot of work and replacement of not just kind of touching up a little stuff, but actually replacement, is when I use the clone stamp tool. And the clone stamp tool is just the letter S, and it too is a cursor. Right bracket makes it bigger, left bracket makes it smaller. Control option controls how hard and how soft that is. I usually run a hardness of 0 so that it blends in very nicely. And I am going to create a new layer in the layers panel and going to call it my retouch layer. And this is where all my work is going to be done, because I do not want to do it directly on the image. That would be destructive. So I've got my cursor size and hardness up here. And my mode is going to be normal. My opacity is going to be 100%. I want the flow to be 100%, and I do not want my airbrush effect turned on. I don't want to rotate this. I don't want to rotate at 5 degrees. I'm going to set that to 0. I do want this aligned, and I want to make sure I sample all layers. Okay? Because if I clone on a blank layer, I will get nothing. And we're going to talk about current layer and below and all layers here in a bit, once we get this underway. So with the clone stamp tool, this requires you going in very much like the healing brush tool, requires a sampling area. So if I would like to fix this frisbee here, I need to put my cursor in an area I would like to sample from, hold down my Option or Alt key to get that target, and then once I sample from there and I begin to paint, you're going to see that those little crosshairs are going to follow me along, and they're going to be aligned with what I've sampled. And I simply paint over this. And what that does is it puts it on the new layer that I have right there. Moving up to the roof here, I'm going to do this roof section. Now, something that is very common when people use the clone stamp tool. Basically, the clone stamp tool simply it's the equivalent of copy paste. It clones. That's all it does. There's no healing, there's no blending, there's no color adjustment. You're taking from one area to another. If I start up here and I begin to clone, and I put my cursor over here and I begin to clone, you'll notice that those little crosshairs follow me along. Now the problem with this is, if I keep going, you'll see that this is cloning. And what I'm doing is I'm just simply repeating that same set of content and just moving it over. And this is something that happens quite often. So either start down here so that you're not going to clone into itself, or come over here, Option or Alt click, and clone over this area, and then stop and let go of your mouse. Once you let go of your mouse, this is baked in, and now I don't need to Option or Alt click again, because when I click again, it remembers the distance and the space away from my initial Option or Alt click, and I can continue on with what I'm doing. So, makes it super simple. The key to this is, instead of cloning and just moving it all over, let go, and then you can continue cloning so it doesn't pick up any more content. Now, it's always interesting, because when we look at something like this, I always like to ask people, what do you think is harder to remove, the shadow on the driveway or the stilts around the tree? And the answer is the shadow in the driveway. And the reason why is because there is a slight color change in the driveway, from the yellow reflecting off the door to the blue down here at the driveway. So even though this is a driveway and it just looks like concrete, you got to be really careful of where you clone without making it look like you have this strip or this spotty driveway. So interestingly enough, it is actually easier to remove these little stilts from around the tree than it is to do a good job on the driveway. And I'm going to show you the best way to go in and remove these. So, the clone stamp tool, you go in and you Option or Alt click and sample and you begin to clone. The one thing that I tell people never do, don't go in here and then clone from the middle and start to go to clone to the edges, because every time you do this, you're going to keep getting all these little edges of everything kind of there, and you see this little hint of these edges. So my saying is, don't nibble from the middle. Don't ever start in the middle of something and work to the edges. Always start where there's a separation point. And what I mean is, I'm going to Option or Alt click here where there's a clear separation point between the driveway and the grass. I'm going to Option click there. And the cursor gives you a preview. And that preview allows you to line that up exactly where you need to be. And then I click and I begin to paint. And with that clone stamp tool, I can very clearly and easily get that line lined up. So here, I've got a section of rock and the grass. So I'm going to go over someplace where I can park my cursor between the rock and the grass, Option or Alt click, and come over here with the preview and my cursor, and then line that up in a position where I think that is going to work very well. Looks good. Now I get to this little shrubbery right here, and this green little bush, kind of ends here. I'm going to go over to this bush right here, to the end, and I'm going to Option or Alt click there, and I'm just going to paint all around here because I just need kind of the end of the bush around there. Simple. Coming up to these kind of bushes, there's no real definition of the bush right there, so I may just jump over here and just kind of clone in a little bit around there. I don't see that much kind of sticking out, so not a big deal. Grab the shadow here and kind of just park a little bit of shadow. Great. Okay. Now, don't feel that because we're in the spot or the clone stamp tool, we have to use that all the time. You could jump over to the spot healing brush very easily, and I could reduce the size of that cursor and I could just go over these lines a little bit. But if you did want to stay with the clone stamp tool, I have the edge of my rock, so I need to get rid of this little wire that's there. I'm going to Option or Alt click on the edge of the rock there, park that right there, and just paint right over. It's great. Takes care of it. And that fast, it looks like I know what I'm doing, which is a good thing. Over here with the rock, I can complete the entire process, do the same process again. I can come over here where I've got this transition of the rock, and I'm going to Option or Alt click there between the rocks, and then park my cursor right here, and I begin to clone up and down. One thing you want to watch out for here is cloning repetition. It's amazing how you can have millions of pixels in an image, but something like this where the pixels are identical, for some reason your eye gets drawn right to them. So here, if I were to see this, this would be a dead giveaway that I had cloned. So I'm going to come back with my clone stamp tool, and I'm going to make it a much smaller size by using my left bracket. I'm just going to Option click someplace else on the rocks and just kind of hit it, just in that one little location so that your eye doesn't get drawn to that duplication. Down here, I'm going to grab my clone stamp tool again, Option or Alt click kind of in that green and shadow area, line that up, and just kind of go back and forth here. On the sidewalk here, I want more sidewalk, so I'm actually going to come over here to where my grass and my sidewalk meet, okay? And I may kind of go in here and park my cursor there and just kind of get rid of that. Watch out that I don't come over here and start cloning the tree, okay? Want to stop and go in and clone that right there. And then I may go back and Option or Alt click at the edge of the grass and the sidewalk here, and then clone down here, giving myself enough free space where I sampled so that my little crosshairs, that little plus, doesn't run into the tree and sample something I don't want. Here, with the highlights and the shadows of the rock, this is a little bit tricky because I got the angle shadow of the rock, and does that shadow of the rock stop in the middle here, or does the lighter face stop here? You be the judge. I'm going to Option or Alt click at the edge of the face of the rock here, and I'm just going to kind of clone that in just like that. Come up to the top of the rock here, and I'm going to clone that in as well. And in this background, I kind of just need some type of shadow or bark, and I may just come over here with this bark and the shadow here, and I may just throw in just a little bit of bark and shadow. Don't go too far, or else I'm going to start picking up this little blue. I'm just going to grab this shadow, and I think I'm just going to run the shadow a little bit longer behind here. No one's going to know. And then come here at the edge of the rock and go both directions to clone that out. Now you can see where I've got my duplication here and my duplication here. Grab my clone stamp tool, Option or Alt click, and just kind of touch those up. You know, just kind of like dabbing a little bit, and it's done. That easy. So, wow, okay, that looks great. So if we were to look at this, there it is. Now this has all been done on its own layer, and we can turn that on and turn that off, and it's almost impossible to tell. Maybe that little band on the tree right there. I'm just going to come here and I'm just going to do that. There we go. Now it looks totally believable. And here's my retouch layer, by the way, folks. That's all that's on there. There's my frisbee right there, there's my vents, and there are my little stilts on the tree. Anything goes wrong, I can go back to that layer and I can simply erase those areas. Now coming over to the driveway, this is where it requires a little bit more skill. So I'm going to grab my clone stamp tool, and I'm not going to start here in the middle of the driveway. I'm going to start at the edges. Now here at the edge, you'll notice, and I'm going to show you this, this is very yellow. So if I clone and sample from up here and I paint down here, you'll see how very yellow this is. So I can't stray very far from this shadow line going across the driveway. So I'm going to use my saying that I say, don't nibble from the middle. So I'm going to start from the edge. And I'm going to option click where this plant kind of comes to the edge of the driveway. And I'm going to clone that right through there to kind of fill in that area of the bush, okay? And since I've got this little double flower thing here and here, I'm going to option click and I'm just going to kind of put a little bit more plant in there so it doesn't look the same. Coming through here, we have a little double whammy where this is at an angle, so we can't just clone back and forth here without an issue. Now, because this crack in the driveway is so skinny, I can't start way down here, because if I do, it's going to be too blue. Up here is too yellow. So I need to start fairly close to where this is going to be. Now, because this little crack in the driveway is so narrow, it's like 1 pixel, I got to be careful that I get that lined up exactly where it needs to be, or else when I do this, it's going to be off 1 pixel in the directions, both directions. So I'm just going to clone that kind of back and forth there to get that away from the edge. Now what I'd like to do is I'd like to paint in a straight line here. So what I'm going to do is start down here. I'm going to Option or Alt click here, and I'm going to park my cursor there, and I'm going to click once. I'm going to come to the end, I'm going to hold down my Shift key, and I'm going to Shift click, which allows me to paint in a straight line. Now when I zoom out, you can clearly tell in this area that I've got pixels that are duplicated. And I can kind of see kind of the line that I have. So this worked out really well, but I'm going to grab my clone stamp tool again, Option or Alt click, and just kind of dab those little areas a bit, just kind of going around. Now I want to stay very close to these areas, but I just want to disturb the surface enough that I don't noticeably see any type of duplication of pixels, okay? So I may grab a little bit bigger brush and just kind of come in here. Now again, you don't want to do too much here because then it's going to start looking kind of spotty. And you want to stick very close to these areas, not too far away, to pick up the wrong color, okay? So even still, you can see kind of a little bit of the line. I may increase the size of the cursor a little bit and just kind of touch those little areas and disturb the surface. I'm going to come back down here again. I'm going to Option or Alt click over here. And I'm going to click on the end of the line, come down to the end here and Shift click, which then draws in a straight line. And it was a little bit too close to that line, so you saw that little highlight. So I'm going to try that again. I'm going to Option or Alt click a little bit higher here, click there, hold down my Shift key and click there. Now the reason why I started off the end here is because if I came down here and started directly above the line, I would have run into the grass over here and cloned in the grass. So give that a shot and see. So that's looking pretty good here. And so I'm just going to sample over here and make sure I'm on the right layer here and not sampling on the original layer. And I see this little rust spot in the driveway too. So I'm going to come over here and just get rid of that little rust spot, that little one right there. And this bothers me right here, this little double extra pixel. So I'm going to sample from up here and line that up to make that look good. And this is tricky because this is such a narrow little crack in the driveway. I got to get it just right. So that's what it looks like when it's all done and taken care of. So this is the before, and that's the after. Clone stamp tool. Now, what's interesting with the clone stamp tool here is this sample current layer, and below, and all layers. The reason why the clone stamp tool has this is because you may be working in with a document that has adjustment layers. And if I have an adjustment layer, say up above here, that I was working with because I wanted to get some more contrast out of this, and I have an adjustment layer here and I'm cloning, the one thing that you do not ever want to do is you don't want to clone and have the effect of the adjustment layer be cloned into your image. So if I've adjusted this darker or lighter, or changing the hue or saturation, or giving it more contrast, when I use the clone stamp tool, it samples everything. So here, if I sample all layers, it will sample my adjustment layers here, which is something you don't want to do, which is why we have current and below. Current layer and below will take this and all of my other layers here, because color adjustment layers tend to be on top of the pixel-based layers and therefore adjusting everything below. Now, if you don't do that and you forget that you're using all layers here, this little bobber right here is basically the button that turns off the adjustment layers. Now, if you hover over this, it says turn off to include adjustment layers when cloning. And you're like, turn off to include, turn on to not include. The wording is kind of weird, okay? So here's the deal. Basically, when you have this, it's going to include all the layers, and with the button not gray. Gray actually means that it's on because it's pushed into the surface. Again, not totally intuitive. But if I click this, that basically says, ignore any of the adjustment layers, regardless of what you have chosen here. And this is really important. If you turn that on, this is on, by the way. Just think of the button being pushed into the surface, okay? I know, dark is on, doesn't make sense. So if you forget to choose current and below, this will go ahead and it will make sure that you do not want to include adjustment layers. So it says turn off to include adjustment layers. I don't want to include adjustment layers. It's on now, okay? That's what you want. In the end, push that so it's gray, it's on, and you won't have that problem. But I want to talk about the clone stamp tool here when I'm doing retouching on a person. And the clone stamp tool doesn't mean that we just go in and we take something and replace it with something else, just a wholesale replacement. I want to show you how I would use this to go ahead and just kind of do some light retouching without wholesale moving, replacing. So I'm going to create a new layer, and this is going to be my retouch layer, which is where all my content's going to be on. But here, what I'd like to do is, he's got just a little bit of darkness under his eyes. You know what, I just want to take that back ever so slightly. Now if I take my clone stamp tool and I Option or Alt click here and I paint this all in, you can see that I just remove the whole thing and it looks completely fake. But what I want to do is I want to adjust the opacity of this, and I'm just going to take my brush or my clone stamp tool. I'm going to type in the number 3, and whatever number you type in gives you that opacity. So if I'm dealing with an opacity, say, of 20 or 30 or 40, just type in number 2 to get 20. You don't even have to have this selected. What I'm going to do is come down here and I'm going to work in the area. Remember, you got to have free space. So this is what I want to retouch under his eye. So I'm going to grab the free space under here and kind of walk through the motions to make sure I'm not going to run into anything I don't want. I'm going to Option or Alt click down here, and then I'm going to come back under his eye. I'm going to paint. Then I'm going to let go. And I'm going to do that again and let go. I'm going to do that again and let go. Now, I've gone too far, but what I love about this feature is that every time I let go, it applies another hit of the clone stamp tool. I'm going to come under my window menu and I'm going to open my history panel. And what I like about this is that every time I let go of the mouse, it records that in my history. And what I can do is I can come in here and I can see which clone stamp function that I did is going to be the best. And when you get into retouching, you can get so ingrained in what you're doing that I say you go Photoshop blind, that you start to retouch and you get just so engrossed in what it is that you don't really pay attention. So what I'd rather do with this is clone with a very light opacity and do it numerous times so I can go back in here and see how this works, rather than just doing it at full opacity and being like, well, that's the way it is, and then have to go back with the eraser and kind of erase that content. So this is kind of a cool feature that I like. This is also really good for reducing ever so slight wrinkles here, because I'm not going in and trying to make this person look like a supermodel or anything. I just want to go in and just make it look like the person sees themselves. So if I have any type of kind of wrinkles here, again, I would probably do the same thing. Probably start off with like a 10% opacity, Option-Alt-Click, and just go back and forth, letting go of the mouse each time that I go in and paint, just to kind of reduce that a little bit. We're not trying to get rid of everything here. It just needs to be lessened. Great, that works great. He's also got a little crease line under his eye here, and I'd like to just kind of remove this darkness or just knock it back a little bit. I'm going to start over here on his cheek, only because I have such a low opacity that you're not going to really see the texture. So I'm going to Option or Alt click over here, and I'm just going to paint under his eye a little bit here, just to kind of remove that little area as we go. Just clean it up a little bit. Now remember, it's all done in this retouch layer, so if I would like to take this back a little bit later, when I zoom back out, I can always go back in with my eraser, and I can set the opacity of that eraser way down to, say, 30%, I'll just type in the number 3, and then I can just go back over that area on its own layer and just take that back a little bit just by erasing. So that works really good. Now, I've always been a huge fan of the clone stamp tool, so instead of using the spot healing brush, I could just go in and I could just do some basic retouching of this content here. Now, you got to be a little bit more careful because there is no help whatsoever with this. And using the opacity is really nice because you can go back in and you don't have to do a full hit of this. And if you like to use the Wacom tablet and the pressure sensitivity, the cool part with this is this has the pressure sensitivity button. So if you're using a Wacom tablet or a pencil, what you can do is, with a pressure sensitivity, you can control the opacity of what you're doing by the pressure of your cursor. Now, I've always been a mouse person to go ahead and retouch here, but there is a distinct advantage to using the stylus or the pressure sensitivity here. For the light areas, you can just use a light pressure, which gives you light opacity, and you can use heavy pressure, which just then gives you full opacity. But again, it's all going to be how you feel with going in and doing the retouch here. You do have to be careful with the clone stamp tool because there is no blending, there is no help. So something like this, when you're going in and you're trying to sample something like this, I'm going to set the opacity down to about 60%, go in here, just kind of hit that a couple times, and you do have to be careful. I may come back out here with a little bit lower opacity or very low opacity, maybe Option or Alt click here, and with very low opacity kind of come in, just touch those areas to lighten it up. So a lot of great stuff that you can do. Certain things like this, where he's just got this little anomaly there on his lip, I may come in here with a clone stamp tool and just kind of go back over this several times, back and forth, letting go of the mouse, just to kind of touch that up and heal that as well. So different ways that you could go in and use the clone stamp tool. It doesn't have to be at full force, and it doesn't have to be at 100%. So a lot of little fine lines, wrinkles, maybe the shadow of his dimple right there is just a little bit too much. I'm going to start up here with a very low opacity of that brush, and I can just kind of bring that back ever so slightly here as well. Maybe cut back that shadow a little bit right there. So I'm going to turn off that retouch layer as we come back in here, and you can see just those little bits and pieces as we go in. Now remember, this is done on its own layer. You can adjust the opacity of this layer overall, and it's going to adjust all of your retouching effects here. Okay, so maybe you've done a little bit too much. You can just cut back the opacity to kind of bring that back as well. Or you can go in just with your eraser here with varying opacities on this retouch layer and just kind of remove some of the things that you may have gone a little bit too far on. But the clone stamp tool is fantastic. And this is just a quick overview on how you could go through and do this. And these are general areas going in and working with. Now, the hard stuff comes with a clone stamp tool when you're doing something like this, where you've got patterns and you've got textures and you have to clone this out. Then you got to be really careful about going in here and cloning all along the lines here. Because if I grab the clone stamp tool here and I set this at 100% and I begin to clone here, if I just come over here and I clone, I got to be really careful about matching up this pattern here to fit. But you'll notice that it's like, oh my gosh, I got this curve. So if I start to clone here, you can very clearly see that the pattern doesn't change the direction. So if we go into the window menu, what we can do is we can call up the clone source panel. And the clone source panel allows me to change the angle of this brush, okay, or the cursor here. So I could go in here, and what I'm going to do is I'm just going to use my shift up arrow, which is going to obviously make the numbers go up. If I don't use the shift, it's going to go up in tenths of a point. If I just use the shift, it's going to go up in whole numbers here. And what I want to do is I want to go down to rotate it counterclockwise. And I can see how that works here if we zoom in really close, okay? You can see I'm going to sample right here, and you can see there is my preview of this, okay? And that's rotated -5 degrees. And I can see as I rotate this up or down, I can actually see the rotating preview in my cursor. So this is a little bit tricky to have to do. So here I've got it rotated like 2 degrees and maybe rotated a little bit more to be able to get in here and sample over here, which looks completely misaligned, but then be able to paint in or clone in over here at that angle. So if I go in and I do my -5 degrees, that's great. And then what I'm going to do is take my close out of my clone source here as well. And I'm going to make sure that my hardness of my brush is set back down to 0 so it blends in very nicely. And I sample over here, and then I can begin to clone right there and blend that in, matching the angle of this. This is tricky because you can see it starts to get a little bit darker over here, but this is the way that you can get into more tricky areas and kind of blend this in. This is just going to take a lot of time. You may have to have a much smaller cursor here and then come over and sample and just kind of work your way through this and sample and begin to work this back and forth. Here I may start over here and then do a slightly less opacity on the brush right there, but then I'd have to go in and I'd have to change my angle because you can see here that my angle isn't right. But this is definitely more advanced and this would take a lot of time to get that curve to fit. But that's how you can start working toward something like that. So, clone stamp tool, one of my favorite tools, something that I've used many times. Quite versatile. You can use it at full opacity, and you can also use it in any opacity that you want if you just want to do kind of knocking back little bits and pieces, shadow area, anything kind of wrinkles or any stuff that you just want to smooth over nicely without just completely replacing.